This is 8.2.1, video number 2, Introduction to Imaginary Numbers. In the first video, we were talking a little bit about the motivation for where imaginary numbers came from. You checked out the historical math notes box and you watched the two imaginary numbers are real videos before coming back to this. Okay? So definition of imaginary numbers. This is all coming from, at some point in time, people were dissatisfied with the fact that we just stopped here and we said, well, there's no real number, there's no real solution that makes this true. And they said, let's figure out a different set of numbers to help us solve this. And so when you take the square root of both sides here, you still get plus or minus. Every time you have something squared, you get plus or minus the square root of -1. And again, instead of just saying, oops, I can't do this anymore, at some point in time, somebody said, well, let's call this I for imaginary. Okay? So the solution to this equation, there are two. One is positive I, one is negative I. Okay? So the definition of I is the square root of -1. The definition of I is the square root of -1. So you're just going to need to know and remember that fact. Okay? Let's see how that works a little bit. So in this example, example number 3, we're being asked to simplify these expressions. Again, typically we'd see a negative inside the square root, we'd be bailed out and we'd just say, oh, we can't do it. But now we know that we can do it. Okay? So I can rewrite this as the square root of 4 times the square root of -1. Okay, we know that the square root of 4 is 2. We now know that the square root of -1 is I. So our answer is just I. I'm sorry, the answer is 2I. Okay, I like to think about it as in the house, mom does not allow negativity. When she sees negativity in the house, she kicks it out and it becomes the imaginary friend outside. Okay? It's just like saying square root of 4 is 2. The square root of a negative number is always I. Okay? So square root of 18 is the same thing. Okay? Square root of 18 times the square root of -1. Now, the square root of 18 can still be broken down further. We can say it's the square root of 9 times the square root of 2 times the square root of -1. Okay? Square root of 9 we know is 3. Square root of -2 we cannot simplify further. We now know the square root of -1 is just I. When there's negativity, kick it out and make it an I. Okay? We don't typically write it like this. We typically write the I before you get to the square root, so it's not at all in question whether or not the I is under the square root or after. So the way you're going to see your book write it, most mathematicians write it, is going to look just like that, 3I root 2. Okay? Now, what we've been talking about is what's called pure imaginary numbers. So these are 4 examples of pure imaginary numbers. Pure means it's only imaginary parts. There are no real parts to these numbers. 2I, I times the square root of 3, pi I, and -15.2I are all pure imaginary numbers. Just like any other variable, this does mean 2 times I. This does mean I times the square root of 3. This does mean -15.2 times I. Okay? Before doing operations with imaginary numbers, we want to get them in pure imaginary number form first. So example 4, instead of multiplying the numbers together first, getting 36, and then saying the answer is 6, we need to take each part and write it in a pure imaginary form first. Okay? So mom is kicking out the negativity, and on the outside it becomes an I. The square root of 9 is 3, so this part right here is 3I. Okay? Same thing with the second part. Okay, mom is kicking that negativity out. Go outside and play with your imaginary friend. The square root of 4 is 2. So this part is 2I. First job is to take each of these pieces and turn them into pure imaginary numbers. Then we are multiplying, so we multiply just the same as we would do if this was any other variable. If this was 3x and 2x, our answer would be 6x squared. Okay, so it's the same thing, 6I squared. But there's one more thing that you need to know. We never leave a final answer with I with any exponent at all, okay? So we have to go back to the definition of I. We have 6, okay? That doesn't change. Our definition of I says that, I'm actually going to write it as 6 times I times I. I squared is I times I. Okay, 6 times I, and we know that I, the definition, is just the square root of negative 1. Square root of negative 1, 6. Okay, when you multiply these two things together, the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, you just get negative 1. So your final answer here is negative 6. Okay, so I'm going to add to my definition that we started with. Okay, we said you need to know this, and you absolutely do. An easy way to help you simplify things is if you know that I squared is always equal to negative 1. Okay, I squared is always equal to negative 1. I is equal to the square root of negative 1. These two things are very related. This one will help you when it comes to simplifying. If you're trying to simplify an expression that has something higher than an exponent of 1, you're going to want to remember this fact. Okay? So let's try this one. It's the same as the first one. Square root of negative 2. Okay? We don't know the square root of 2. We can't simplify that any further. So we're just going to say I root 2. Okay? The square root of 8, we certainly can break down, but I'm going to show you why it might be helpful in this case not to break it down first. Okay? The negative does make it I. I'm going to make it I root 8. Okay? Now that we've pulled the i's out, now we can multiply them together. That sounds kind of scary. I times I squared. Square root of 2 times square root of 8 is the square root of 16. Okay? We just talked about what I squared is equal to. I squared is equal to negative 1, and we know the square root of 16 is 4. So when you multiply those together, you get negative 4. And the big thing to remember, and this is going to be a little bit tough sometimes, is we don't want to multiply these two things first. Okay? The square root of negative 9 times the square root of negative 4 is not equal to the square root of positive 36. Okay? That is not equal. You cannot do that. So just pay attention to the details here. One more set of examples. Example 5. We have the square root of negative 4/9. Okay, same thing we would normally do. Again, I see a negative sign, so Mom kicks it out and it becomes an I on the outside. Okay, how do we find the square root of a fraction? We find the square root of the top. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of the bottom is 3. So you could write it 2/3 I. You could write it 2I over 3. Traditionally, this is the way it's written. Okay, a number times I as opposed to a number times I divided by another number. Okay, over here, same thing. This just makes it an I. So square root of 24, we'll deal with that in a second, divided by the square root of 25 times I. Now we know we can break down 24 into the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. So the top becomes 2 root 6. The bottom remains 5 times I. This is the best way to write the simplified version of square root of negative 24.